Despite the lateness of the hour, Armitage had been lying wide awake in bed when the phone sat on his bedside table had begun to ring, loudly and insistently. But it had taken a significant amount of time and effort for him to successfully lever himself up into a seated position in order to take the call. All throughout this manoeuvre, he had struggled to ignore the throbbing pain that lanced up and down his right leg, the main reason that sleep continued to elude him. The operator had been polite, yet predictably forceful during their brief conversation, which had opened with a cursory apology for the timing of the call. She had gone on to relate that somebody was being held at the station on suspicion of murder, and that a car would be along shortly to collect him in order to lead the interview. Armitage had started to assure that he did not require the transport, and could walk the modest distance to the station before he was cut off mid-sentence. It appeared the arrangements had already been made, as per the superintendent's very specific orders. The call was then terminated, moments later. Easing himself across the room in order to dress, Amos Armitage sighed wearily. The voice on the other end of the phone line was as aware as he was that his protests had been little more than mere bravado. In the 3 years since the fragments from the German artillery shell had perforated his right leg, he had so far managed to regain pitifully little feeling in the damaged limb. By the time he had finished dressing and forced his protesting body down the staircase, the policeman could already hear the car engine idling in the road outside his lodgings. Through the vehicle's open passenger door, he found a familiar and friendly face waiting there to greet him, one he had first met during his time in France. By the end of the hostilities, a bond had been forged between himself and Lachlan Finlay that few who had not served in the war could ever understand. Indeed, the friendship that had formed between the pair had been so strong that Scott had elected to return with him to Dudley, rather than his own native homeland. Watching as his supervisor hauled himself stiffly into the passenger seat of the car, Detective Constable Findlay knew better than to offer any assistance to his superior. But this was a minor issue. There were still countless other ways he could make his sergeant's life easier, without further wounding the man's shattered pride. The pair would spend the next few minutes it took to drive to the police station, theorising the events that had dragged them both from their beds that evening. More likely than not, a domestic murder. Perhaps a fight at a local hostelry that had got out of hand. It would transpire that neither could have been more wrong. As the car had come to a halt in Priory Street, several men could be seen scuffling on the pavement directly outside the mock Tudor entrance to the town's police station. Recognising that a number of those involved in this fight were their uniformed colleagues, the two detectives quickly alighted from their vehicle, hurrying across the street to assist. It took little time for the detective sergeant to identify the volatile bunch besieging the front office of the police station as having originated from the local gypsy settlement, their accents and mannerisms utterly unique to their community. Quickly gauging the most senior of the group, Armitage made a point of engaging the older man one-on-one, reminding him of his responsibilities to his younger kin. Were he and his fellows to be detained for their conduct, that may necessitate inquiries by the local constabulary at their campsite. This in turn could lead to further arrests and charges, dependent on what was to be found there. The subtle threat hit home like a sledgehammer, the older gypsy's mind clearly listing a multitude of sin, potentially waiting to be found within his home, or those of his neighbours. Within moments he was hurriedly calming the tempers of those around him, while simultaneously pleading with the sergeant for tolerance and for understanding. It was explained that a cousin of one of their number had been killed, and the man responsible for her death had apparently handed himself in for the crime. He was believed to be the son of a local man that had caused trouble at their encampment in the past, and his people were determined to gauge the truth in this rumour. Assuring the older gypsy he would speak with them again, upon learning the full detail of the case, Armitage then ordered several constables to escort the group clear of the town centre. But no sooner had he and Finlay stepped away and progressed through the doors into the front office, they found yet further confrontation awaiting them there. A barrel-chested man, bedecked in well-worn labourer's overalls, and presenting a somewhat shambolic appearance, was in the act of being restrained inside the door by two further constables. With the officer detaining him briefly distracted by the unexpected entry of the detectives, Their customer now managed to shrug free, flailing wildly towards the approaching Armitage. But the blow never connected, the stocky Findlay stepping forwards to obstruct the oncoming assault. Moments later, the army veteran delivered a sharp and calculated jab of his own, instantly felling the attacker. As the uniformed officers hurriedly took hold of the prone figure, clearly eager to amend for their error, Armitage's gaze fell upon the young boy, stood watching him nearby. The child was equally as worn in appearance as the adult he accompanied, his face grubby, bearing a mixture of fresh and faded bruises, features etched in a mixture of anger and anxiety. It was related by one of the constables that these were the father and brother of the murder suspect, who had found themselves unexpectedly forced to remain inside the station by the arrival of the victim's family. It was clear from the ease with which Findlay had bested the father, and his dishevelled appearance, it was likely alcohol had played more of a part in his defeat than any other factor. Once again taking control of the situation, Armitage ordered Findlay to ensure the detainee was placed in a cell to sober up, and that someone find a hot meal for the boy, before settling down in readiness to interview their kin. As he sat waiting in the interview room for Findlay to return, the detective sergeant had pored over the papers pertaining to the alleged murder. It transpired that Matthew Nolan had stumbled in through the front doors of the police station earlier that evening, wild-eyed, wearing a haunted expression. He had informed the officer on duty there that he had killed a woman, and she was lying dead in the bed at some lodgings, situated a short walk away. Sitting him down, the duty sergeant had finally satisfied himself that Nolan's irrational manner was no prank or tall tale, before dispatching officers to attend the building. One of the two had returned minutes later, breathless, explaining that what the youth had said was true, that the body of a woman had indeed been found in the room he had identified. The sergeant had arrested Nolan on suspicion of murder there and then of this unknown woman, before ordering that a doctor be fetched and the superintendent be informed. As he leafed through the doctor's sketches and the notes taken at the scene, Armitage winced at the manner of the girl's death. She was naked. It was assumed that whatever had happened had been the result of some form of domestic argument between the two. It was not yet known who she was, and the boy himself was not well known enough to the officers at the station to indicate her identity, in somewhat sharp contrast to his father. Francis Nolan was a notoriously heavy drinker, prone to settle any situation with fists rather than other means. His long-suffering wife had been quick to depart their marriage, leaving their two young sons behind in the process. Reading through the case papers, Armitage found his thoughts again turning to the prisoner's 8-year-old younger brother, James, silently watching on as his drunk of a father tried to fight a station full of police officers, with no hope of success or thought of the effect it may have on his young son. Shaking his head slowly, he glanced up to see that Constable Findlay had materialised inside the room, handing him 2 cups of coffee in the process. They spoke at length, discussing the potential avenues they may take in the interview that was coming, before requesting the prisoner be brought before them. As he was manhandled into the room, his handcuffs temporarily loosened before being reattached to a metal ring on the desk, Matthew Nolan's face was a picture of grim resignation. He had not bothered to look up as Findlay began to speak, barely seeming to register the detective's words. Throughout the questioning, his eyes remained miserably fixed on the surface of the desk in front of him. Gradually, as time wore on, the Scotsman's manner and tone had hardened. He began to belittle and demean the subject in an effort to elicit some form of response for him to work with. But Nolan had remained silent and dejected, ignoring the questions, which in turn became taunting demands, which in turn degenerated into base insults. It was only after Armitage had softly asked about his family, and the fate that may befall his younger sibling when the gypsies eventually discovered he was the killer, that the suspect's eyes finally rose to meet his gaze. And after receiving assurances that young James would be protected from vengeance and be cared for in his absence, the boy's older brother finally told his tale. It had never been easy for Matthew Nolan to make friends with the children he had gone to school with, his father's reputation and violent manner inevitably turning his peers against him. But William Burt hadn't seemed to care who Matthew's father was, and had loyally stuck by him through many years of name-calling and mickey-taking. On leaving school, the two had gone to work together at the same yard, producing blocks and concrete slabs, which were then bought in bulk by the area's numerous building firms. And every Friday, without fail, the pair would make their way home via a stop-off at the Fish Inn, where they would drown their concerns in a sea of ale. But one evening, a few weeks prior, Bert had been fixated on a redhead sat alone at the bar. Nolan had later returned from the toilet to find his friend now sat striking up conversation with her, his intentions for the evening fairly obvious. Deciding to improve his friend's chances of success, the young labourer had taken up his jacket and wordlessly moved past the pair, trying hard to suppress a wry smile as he did so. It was as he had been doing this, he had identified the girl as a gypsy from her distinct accent, which was neither fully English nor Irish in manner. As was customary in the Nolan household, Matthew had spent the rest of that weekend trying to ensure that neither he nor his brother unwittingly provoked their father. He had been surprised then when there had been a knock on the door late on Sunday and discovered his friend's younger sister stood there in a state of distress. She pleaded with Nolan, explaining William had not come home all weekend, and in doing so had not provided their mother with his wages, which were needed to provide for the rest of the family. Soothing the girl, Nolan had reassured young James he'd be back soon enough, before setting off at a jog to conduct a tour of the local hostelries. From these brief inquiries, it was clear that William had not been seen since Friday evening, when he had left the Fish in company with the flame-haired gypsy girl. It was with heavy heart he had stopped off at the Burt household, dropping off what remained of his own wage, along with the promise that he would get to the bottom of the matter. When William did not turn up for work the next morning, or indeed ever again, Nolan had extended his inquiries to establishing the identity of the girl, who it appeared had only recently arrived in the Midlands. Unfortunately, with his father having previously been involved in a number of violent run-ins with the inhabitants of the local gypsy settlement, it soon became clear Nolan was limited with how much information he could find. By now convinced that his friend at the very least had been robbed and potentially even killed by the girl's kin, he began to carefully consider his next move. For the entirety of the next 2 weekends, Matthew Nolan spent his evenings stalking the local public houses until he had finally located the girl, again seated alone at a bar. It had not taken long to persuade her to accompany him to a nearby lodging house, one that asked no questions of their customers, as long as they had no money in their pockets. The girl had clearly not recognised him from their previous encounter, and was soon eagerly cajoling him across the room to the bed, promising all manner of pleasure. Nolan had been careful to hide his true motive for the encounter, ensuring she didn't see the knife, which he had hastily concealed in his shoe down the side of the bed as he undressed. Despite his intent to force her into revealing the fate of his missing friend, it was she who had been forceful with him, dominant almost. Young Matthew had been pinned hard against the mattress, as her long fingernails had pressed down deep into the meat of her shoulder. With his eyes having closed momentarily from the pain, as her nails had drawn blood, when he opened them again, he was horrified to discover a nightmarish vision staring back at him. Gone was the beautiful creature he had walked back to the room with, arm in arm. Instead, her once soft skin was now taut and pale, stretched back to expose a twisted framework of deformed bone. The fingernails had elongated and lengthened into sharp talons, which were burrowing deeper into his shoulder, pinning him down hard to the bedding beneath. The monster's eyes were pure white, her pupils having inexplicably disappeared, and as she opened her mouth, a horror of misshapen teeth were now revealed. With a hiss, the girl lunged forward at him, mouth open wide and gaping in preparation to bite. Her breath was hot and rancid, accompanied by a primal hiss that signified that this would be the end for him. But then she froze, a look of confusion falling across her horrifying features, as her mind attempted to come to terms with the knife blade, which was now buried deep into the side of her skull. As the creature's body fell backwards onto the bed with a thud, its momentum yanked the claws free from Nolan's shoulder, sending blood pouring down his torso. Half stumbling and falling, the youth had launched himself from the bed, before pulling up his clothes and turning to take one last look at her dying body. Already, the colour in her skin was now returning, the twisted skeletal frame disappearing as the flesh once again expanded outwards to cover it. and as her teeth began to recede back into their original formation, Nolan was already out on the street, the wind against his face as he bolted through the dark and empty streets, towards the police station. Once the footsteps of the boy and the two officers escorting him had finally disappeared off down the corridor, Finlay had allowed himself a little chuckle. As he rose and began to collect the case papers back together, he complimented Armitage on the interview technique, even if what the youth had said had come out as utter nonsense. Still deep in thought, the senior of the two had ignored these observations, even after they had been repeated, to the extent the constable had then gone on to inquire if he was suffering again from the pain in his leg. Shaken from his self-imposed stupor by the question, Armitage had somewhat curtly responded he was not, before regaining his composure and apologising for being unintentionally short with his subordinate. In truth, he had been in pain throughout the interview, ever since the scuffle in the street, but was determined the injury would not be the thing that defined him in the eyes of others. Agreeing out loud the boy's account, however fantastic it might have been, still amounted to a confession, he now ordered Finlay to start putting the papers together for a remand file. But once the officer had gone off to do so, Armitage had taken another long look at the notes, those of the attending physician, before labouring down to the cell block and requesting access to see Nolan. When he'd be asked to show the detective his shoulder, the boy had duly complied, the bloodied injuries there still yet to be cleaned or treated. Armitage's gaze slowly travelled upwards, from the deep and fresh welts clearly visible across the youth's upper torso, to meet his dejected and helpless features. Turning wordlessly, he ordered for the cell to be secured, before stalking up through the bowels of the station, out through the front office and into the breaking dawn. It took the detective some time to make his way down Castle Hill, towards his destination, the distinctive red and white sandstone buildings of the guest hospital eventually coming into view. The night porters were long gone, their daytime replacements claiming to have no knowledge of the night's events, pleading with the officer to visit at a more reasonable hour, when the doctors were on site. But through relentless cajoling, culminating in a direct threat of arrest for obstructing his investigation, he was finally able to secure access to the mortuary. He had stood and watched on, as the metal gurney was located and then wheeled towards him, his eyes fixing on the arm that suddenly fell sideways from underneath the sheet that had been covering it. And in that moment, as he beheld the gnarled and twisted limb flecked with blood, bearing little resemblance to any human appendage, Amos Armitage finally made up his mind. Politely declining Finlay's suggestion they should reward their endeavours with a hearty breakfast, Armitage had been reaching for his hat when there was a gentle tap at the door. In the sternest of tones, one that left no room for misinterpretation, the secretary there declared that Sergeant Amos was now wanted by the borough commander. Upon protesting he was intending to attend court to speak up at the Nolan hearing, Armitage was informed that his constable would go in his stead, and he was instead to accompany her to see the superintendent. Ignoring the Scotsman's inquiring gaze, Armitage removed his jacket and then followed on as the secretary led him up the stairs, his legs screaming in protest with each step. The superintendent's door was already wide open as he approached, a familiar and imposing figure lurking just inside the threshold, waiting to usher him across. Smiling warmly across the desk at the sergeant, a mug of steaming tea clasped in one hand, Wilbur Steer congratulated him on his night's labours, clearly most satisfied to see another rogue condemned to a life behind bars. Armitage's protest died in his throat as quickly as it formed, as Steer explained in no uncertain terms the report he had completed had now been disposed of, lest it brought the name of the constabulary into disrepute. The body that lay within the confines of the hospital was already on its way for incineration. The man who had created it, now destined to spend the rest of his days in jail for the horrific murder he had admitted to the interviewing officers. He listened on as in calm terms the superintendent informed him tall tales of monsters and magic were best kept for bedtime stories and had no place in police reports. Feeling the anger rising inside him, Armitage tried and failed to retain his composure, aggressively accusing his commander of commending an innocent man to die behind bars. There was a pause, the longest of the detective's life, as the warm smile of Steer's face now disappeared. The senior officer sighed, He placed his mug on the table before rising to his feet. Walking across the room to his window, the senior officer paused, musing out loud that he had feared Armitage would not see reason, and so had taken the step of contacting the neighbouring borough before he called this meeting. A vacancy would soon be rising in the Wolverhampton Borough Police, as their detective inspector was not long for retirement. It would perhaps be best for everyone if Sergeant Armitage looked to take advantage of this opportunity and further his career path, in a fresh environment, amongst a new group of peers. His shoulders slumping in defeat, Armitage had nodded meekly, before rising to his feet and limping from the room, the painful reality dawning on him that he could do little now, other than accept his fate. His stubborn pride had achieved little, other than to now force him away from his hometown, and the post-war life he had only just managed to adjust to. As he passed the cell block on his way down, Armitage momentarily met the gaze of Matthew Nolan, stood waiting to be taken away to court. His father and younger brother, a short distance away from him, their eyes burning with hatred towards the detective and the rest of his policing kind.